Hello, my name is Jakub Kapiszewski and you're watching World Talks straight from Katowice, where European Economic Congress is taking place. And my guest is Professor Guy Standing, a famous economist. Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for attending our studio.
It's great to be back in Poland. I first came to Poland 40 years ago, so as a very young man, I should say, and I'm delighted to be back.
Excellent, brilliant. Let's jump right into the conversation. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on around the world. Right here we have an unprecedented energy crisis going on, and people are starting to say a very bad word starting with a letter R, so recession. In your view, are we facing a recession? How deep can it be?
I think we're already in something strongly like a recession, and we have a real danger of stagflation coming through all the terrifying events that are taking place. We are in a very dangerous moment where in the United States we have what I call a plutarchy. It's a government by the super wealthy in the interests of the super wealthy, and they propped up this man in the White House who is an existential threat to society and to the global economy. We have war in the Middle East, and in the background is a context of a rising China and a declining United States. It's a reality. It reminds me sometimes of the 1930s, when the United States was rising, Europe was declining. And in that context, we have what Gramsci would have called morbid symptoms. And the morbid symptoms are including an incredible threat of inflation, which will be exacerbated by the high expenditure on military hardware, software, and Europe in the middle being forced to spend much more, and you know this very well in Poland, on the arms industry, and thereby diverting resources from our public services, our important realities, our education system, our medical system, our infrastructure. And therefore we have a multiple crisis, a poly-crisis at the moment. And in that context, the groups that I've been writing about, that you want to talk to me about, the precariat, is a very, very dangerous class, because part of it is supporting the Trumps, the Orbans, the AfD, the far right, who are promising to bring back yesterday, a mythical yesterday. But the young, educated part of the precariat are not going to support the populists, but they're looking for a better politics, a more promising politics, which includes redistribution. That is redistribution not only of income, but of power, of voice, and a revival of the institutions that make a civilized society civilized. So we are at a very dangerous moment.
So what you're saying is basically that in the US, growing expenditure on defense goes with the political wind of the times. However, in Europe, I think the situation is very different, because we here try to spend more on defense because we have a very bad neighbor, basically. So these are like two very separate cases. United States doesn't have bad neighborhood, right?
Well, the trouble is, of course, that Trump is throwing NATO out. NATO is really almost redundant now, and forcing us Europeans, including Poland, including Britain, to spend much more on arms for our own defense, not only against Russia, but against other unforeseen threats to us. So we are in this moment where, if we're not careful, our social institutions will suffer as a result of the external pressures which Europe has not done anything to deserve. And that is a context in which political decisions have to be very carefully calibrated for retaining the support of people, bearing in mind that the biggest problem we have in society, in Poland as much as anywhere else, is that millions of people are suffering from chronic insecurity. Insecurity where they don't know what's going to hit them next. They don't have the capacity to deal with it. They are facing high debt, household debt. The firms are trying to struggle with corporate debt, and they're trying to struggle against plutocratic corporations that are huge by comparison with most European corporations in an unequal economic system where China is rising very rapidly. Its manufacturing surplus is huge and growing. And Europe is just struggling to maintain itself. And as an economic system, we need much more unity, much more cohesion. And I think the defeat of Orban recently was a healthy sign, because I think that will enable more European leaders to play a cooperative role in reviving democracy, in reviving respect for our civilizational values, our culture. And in my latest book, I've been very worried about what's happening to the education industry around the world, because it's focusing far more on competitiveness, individual success and failure, and not enough on reproducing the values of our culture, teaching all of us about our history. So we learn the lessons of history, teaching us about our culture, our ethics, our philosophy. All of these things make up a good society. And we're at the risk now of seeing a diminishing capacity to reproduce good society.
Okay, listen, are you suggesting putting more humanities into the curriculum? Yes. Because I think the majority of voices would say otherwise.
Exactly.
We need less humanities and more technical skills.
And I'm strongly against that. Of course, we're all in favor of technical skills. Yeah. We're all in favor of vocational education, but we must realize that higher education since the beginning of time has been about teaching people about empathy, teaching people about how to be civilized, how to treat each other, the ethics and the pursuit of truth. At the moment, we're seeing a disrespect for all of those things, a narcissism that stems from the White House to many other institutions, but a loss of knowledge of our culture. In my book on human capital, I counted, I've been asked to give lectures in 155 universities in 52 countries.
That's a lot.
And
it's like a global tour.
And in many of them, many lectures. And everywhere I've been, it's the same set of complaints. Our students, our teachers are insecure. Our teachers are not able to concentrate on inculcating to the young the values of our society. And we must give due respect to humanities, due respect to philosophy at every level, due respect to art and creative thinking. I want our children, my grandchildren, to be having an education which enables them to develop their creative imagination, to have more play, not less play, to have more capacity to dream. This is what produces civilized, creative adults. And at the moment, we are at a very dangerous point in our education system where there's been an overemphasis on human capital. Mm-hmm. Of course we need skills, but much of what goes on is not producing reliable skills. And the precariat is the first mass class in history. The precariat I've written a lot about. A very interesting issue. It's the first mass class whose level of schooling is higher than the level of job they're likely to get.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
And that is a bizarre situation. And it produces frustration, it produces anger, it produces disappointment. And a lot of what is passing for lifelong learning is really a fraud, commercialized fraud. And I think it's about time I give data in the books to show that a lot of it is commerce trying to sell something to make a profit.
So lifelong learning is a scam, basically what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
I think what you're trying to say is a very long-term project, because it means like shifting totally the emphasis of the education system. But I think there are other stuff that Europe, for example, needs to worry about, because you have USA, which is one superpower, and it competes with the other rising superpower. Europe finds itself in the middle. It has a unique political system which makes it slow to respond, some people would say. And do I understand you correctly, is your idea more European integration?
Of course.
Versus the challenges Europe faces?
I
Because
think
it's also not a very popular argument nowadays, right?
I've never tried to be popular, but I wrote about the precariat in 2011, and I warned in that book that unless the political class responds to the insecurities and the needs of the growing precariat, we would have the risk of authoritarian tyranny. And we are facing that today in a way that is truly existentially dangerous for all of us. And I think we need a rebalance, a realization that growth, economic growth, has to be driven by the needs of ordinary people. I've written a book called The Blue Commons, which is about how the oceans have been converted into a source of super profits, and they're destroying many communities around the world, coastal communities, driving distress migration, which is flooding towards Europe and the United States, because they're the rich areas. And that's leading again to barriers and all the things we know about anti-migration and it's racism by another name. And so we've got a combination of factors, which means that we must look very carefully at what could be a transformational agenda to escape from what's an onrushing dystopia.
Okay, I need you to ask you one question, very short answer. AI. So from what you're saying, I gather that precariat actually is in a worse condition than it was when you wrote the book 15 years ago. How AI fits into this picture?
I call it in my new book the AI paradox. The argument is that as artificial intelligence goes towards the singularity point, human intelligence is going down. And this is a paradox because it's making people lazy intellectually, it's enabling the panopticon state to grow, authoritarian techniques, and our freedom of thinking and freedom of speech is being threatened by AI. And while at the same time, it's not going to eradicate all work. In fact, it's creating a lot of extra work, as I explained, but it is making the income distribution system worse because of intellectual property rights. So more and more of the income and wealth is going to those who have patents and copyright and so on. And then that accentuates the insecurities of the precariat and creates more anger, more morbidity, more suicidal tendencies, particularly among young women, more cardiac problems, more mental breakdowns. We've seen this, deaths of despair, it's called. And I think it's not being too extremist to say that unless we have societal control, democratic control of the new technologies, then they could cause huge human tragedies. We must be alarmist without being defeatist. I believe that European institutions and European culture and history enable us, and what we've learned from terrible tragedies in our history will enable us to say we are in the middle of an existential struggle between a rising China and a declining in the US, and we must represent a civilized approach to say we can do better. And I think that's an exciting moment. Some days I'm pessimistic, some days I'm optimistic, but that's how we should be.
Today you're more optimistic or pessimistic?
It's a lovely day in Katowice, and I think one has to remember Gramsci's saying, famous saying, and I think one has to be optimistic of the will. And I believe that we're seeing the precariat, the educated part of the precariat, the young, particularly women, they're rising, they're becoming more vocal, they're becoming more organized, they're becoming more optimistic. And I talk to many of these groups around the world, and I listen to the energy, I feel the energy. And that energy is coming more united, more green, if you like, and more convivial. So in a sense, yes, I want to be optimistic.
Guy standing optimistic today. Thank you very much for the interview.
It's a pleasure.
And you've watched World Talks on DVP World. My name is Jakub Kapiszewski. Stay tuned for more coverage from Katowice.